Hello, this is Tree Soup D&D. I'm back once again with another video. This time I'll be talking about how to use the Nephilim creatures from Magic the Gathering in your game of Dungeons & Dragons, specifically for the Ravnica setting. Now I myself incorporated the Nephilim into my campaign, and a whole chapter took up the front end of the campaign from levels 1 to 12, so there's definitely a lot of meat there to work with, a lot of raw material to play around with. So what exactly are the Nephilim? The Nephilim were introduced in the second set of the first Ravnica block, called Guild Pact, and they were introduced as a creature for people that weren't all that interested in the guilds and the guild mechanics of the Ravnica block. They just wanted to create some horrible multicoloured monsters to play around with strange rules for people to get creative with. Their biggest feature was that they were 4 colours of magic, 4 out of the 5 colours of magic, which had never been done before and has rarely been done since, as it's quite difficult to build around. But unfortunately, all of the Nephilim were a little bit underpowered. None of them saw competitive play. They weren't really well used, even if they were liked by certain portions of the fan group. So they're not something that's been seen again since. When they have done 4-coloured creatures, they've been other things, not Nephilim. And I think the only one that has been reprinted is the Glint-Eye Nephilim. So yeah, they're a nugget from Magic the Gathering's past. They do represent sort of an interesting portion of Ravnica's history that is a lot of fun to play around with. The Nephilim are creatures from thousands of years ago, from before the signing of the Guild Pact, that have disappeared and then got disturbed by people building in certain areas. And in the story they end up fighting the dragon Niv-Mizzet and Rakdos the demon, but apart from that, that's really all that's written about them. But they do fill in the role in Ravnica as being the eldritch horrors of Ravnica, and in Dungeons & Dragons terms they fill in the role of the great old ones. So if any warlocks wanted to take the great old one path, they would be pointed towards the cult of Yor and the Nephilim. As there is very little that's known about Nephilim, they were kind of a blank slate for writing a campaign around. All I had really to work on was the little that was written about them in the novels, the awesome artwork on the cards, and the rules that were on the cards themselves. So it's not much to go on, but I really liked them, so I persevered, and I would say that it was definitely worth it. I created rules for each of the Nephilim within the game, mainly based on their rules on Magic the Gathering, but not all of them were a great fit for conversion to Dungeons & Dragons rules, so I had to get a little bit creative. So here's a few tokens that I used in my campaign. I'll go into greater detail later on about various monsters that can be used with them, but first of all I'll be talking about the actual abilities of the Nephilim themselves. So one of the main ways to define the Nephilim is that as they are 4-colour creatures, they are sort of defined by their lack of a certain colour as much as they are by their colours of magic. And this also gave a lot of inspiration as to how to deal with each of the monsters. So the first one is the Dune Brood Nephilim. This one is represented by every colour of magic apart from blue. So you could say it's lacking in water. This is one of the easier ones to convert to Dungeons & Dragons. I just made him a big hulking brute that spewed out sand creatures, as he does in the card game. There was a artwork I got off the sand token on Magic Online that gave me this little sand mite character, which makes for good cannon fodder. So when they're fighting him, he just keeps on spewing these out. They're not very powerful monsters, but they can overwhelm you because there's so many of them. The Ink-Treader Nephilim, next up, is one that's defined by its lack of black magic. So it was a little difficult to zero in as to what the lack of black magic actually actually represents, one of the things that black magic can represent is individuality and a sense of self. So you could say that the Ink Trader Nephilim is lacking in individuality, that it's like some kind of hive mind creature or swarm creature. As you can see from the artwork, there's all these little floating guys in the background, so I wanted him to have lots of little guys, so I gave him Inklings. When I first started this campaign, the creature type Inkling wasn't in Magic the Gathering, so I was using just a zoomed in thing of the guys in the background, but eventually Strixhaven came along and Inkling was a thing. But his main power is that he projects an aura around him that anytime someone targets him with a spell that just targets him, just a single target spell, like a Firebolt or Cure Wounds or something, it targets every creature within so many feet within that aura. So if he casts Enlarge, he enlarges all of his minions. If the players cast a spell on him and they happen to be close enough, they will get that spell cast on them as well. So it's a little bit of a puzzle to fight this creature, as you have to work out what exactly is going on. It can be quite scary when your spell ends up hitting your party as well, but it also could mean that your spell hits all of the monsters if you can work out what the range is. Next up is the Yortiller Nephilim. This one is defined by its lack of green magic. So green magic, most obvious thing is that it represents life, but it can also represent lineage and history and tradition, so you could incorporate that as well. In Magic the Gathering, the Yortiller Nephilim ends up raising creatures from the graveyards or resurrecting them to fight for you. I thought it was a little bit obvious, so I didn't go straight on that plan. It probably could have made an interesting fight, but I wanted to go a slightly different route. So what my Yortiller Nephilim does when it attacks is it summons big piles of corpses from out of nowhere, which is represented by this token. So these corpses are blank-faced and featureless and immobile. They're not moving. They aren't resurrected zombies or anything. They're just piles of corpses. So they're not going to be fighting as a creature, but they represent a hazard, because if you're having corpses dropped on you from a great height, that hurts. And also it's difficult to walk through a pile of corpses as well, so they're difficult terrain. And you've also got the added hazard of just the sheer number of corpses appearing will fill a area eventually. I did do a scenario where they were in a locked building. They got locked inside a factory, and it was slowly filling with corpses as they were fighting this Nephilim, so that made it more difficult for them, and the risk of them just drowning in corpses. Next up, we got the Witchmore Nephilim with his artwork that could risk demonetizing your channel. So the Witchmore Nephilim is defined by its lack of red magic. So it's lacking in chaos, lacking in love, lacking in beauty. The rules for the Witchmore Nephilim in Magic the Gathering were just, it got kind of more powerful as the game went on. I struggled to think of a good way to implement it into Dungeons and Dragons. So what I eventually settled on was that when it got hit, it would make copies of itself, or it would spawn copies of itself out of nearby spirits. So as the fight went on, there'd be more versions of the Witchmore running around, and obviously it's got its bite attacks and tongue attacks, and be dangerous that way. It worked out being a little bit overpowered. So if I tried it again, I would probably try and think of something a little less chaotic. The copies ended up having like the remaining hit points of the Witchmore after it got hit, so I was kind of expecting him to hit it really hard, and then these copies weren't going to be that powerful. But if they hit it like a little bit first, then you'd end up with two very big copies, and it was very difficult to balance the scenario that way, because there was a lot of variation in exactly how powerful the copies were going to be. So maybe not to that route. But yeah, it was still an interesting fight, and it worked out in the end. But it was possibly a little bit overpowered. And the last one is the Glint-Eye Nephilim. This is another one that I struggled to come up with a power for, as it's a ability in Magic the Gathering revolves around drawing cards, which isn't really a mechanic in Dungeons and Dragons. So in the end, I settled on the on a power based on its name. The name Glintai conjured the idea of teleportation in my mind, and specifically it teleports via your open eyes. So if you end up figuring out that if you close your eyes it can't teleport to where you are, it solves the problem. But yeah, it's mainly a monster that deals with teleportation, and it shoots eye beams as well for long range attacks. So that's the basic powers of the 5 Nephilim. So for the purposes of structuring a campaign, I wanted to come up with some rules and history and background for what the Nephilim actually were and how they worked, because there wasn't really any information as to that. They just kind of appeared from out of this work site in the books. So I wanted to solidify exactly how they worked. The way to summon a Nephilim is to cast a particular summoning spell with specific words at a ley line nexus of 4 different colours. So there's these ley lines of the 5 different colours of magic all running around the plane all the way through Ravnica, and they cross at certain points, and for each of them where their specific 4 colours cross, that's where you can summon them. And you need a specific staff called the Staff of Welling in order to do so, and when you do it, it shatters the staff into pieces and breaks the staff. So in the campaign, it would have been the cultists of yore that have been growing in influence. They end up summoning the Nephilim, and then they cause havoc, and the party defeats them in some way, and then they disappear. But the other rule I had for them is that when they're defeated, they will reappear 2 weeks later at the same confluence of ley lines, and they will be stronger the second time around. And if they defeat them at that point, they come back again even stronger. So you have this ongoing time frame where the Nephilim come back every 2 weeks, getting stronger. So the fights are getting stronger, and eventually they reach a point where they just need like the armed forces of Ravnica to step in to even attempt to fight these things. So they end up having to find a proper way to defeat them, as they can't just keep on destroying them and having them come back as proper as more powerful creatures each time. When I was trying to come up with ways to the Nephilim themselves, what they actually are is, I decided they were the detritus of gods. Ravnica, City of Guilds, is a increasingly secular society. The gods are playing less and less of a part in Ravnican society. People don't believe in gods or worship gods so much. There's a few knocking around still, like Matt Slesnia, the World Soul, which is the Payroon of the Slesnia Guild, and there's Rakdos, the demon, sort of fulfills the role of a deity to a degree. Yeah, the pantheon of gods is sort of replaced by just overall belief in the guilds themselves. People are focusing on guild power rather than god power. With the gods missing, there's sort of little bits of gods and sort of bits of people's belief and memory of gods sort of floating around that eventually coalesce into Nephilim. You look at each of the artworks of the Nephilim, they're made up of, a lot of them are made up of different parts of this, that and the other, like especially the Yortilla Nephilim. He's got this big baby head and all these like floating teeth, and the Witchmore Nephilim's got a strange face on it. They look like they could be made up of elements of other things, all stitched together. And I theorise that these are bits of other gods. This could be some other god's head, this is some other god's face, this is some other god's eye. Creates a sort of a cycle that goes round and round and round throughout Ravnican history, is that people's belief in gods wanes, and in their place Nephilim rise up, and eventually the Nephilim will be destroyed, and people's belief in gods will raise up again, more gods will appear. You'd say that these 5 Nephilim are not the only Nephilim. There could be other Nephilim, and there have been other Nephilim in the past. That these, rather than them sort of just appearing out of the ground, they appear from the cult of yore, rising up every now and again as they reinstill their belief in Nephilim. and it sort of works as a mind virus that makes its way through history. As long as there's some knowledge of the Nephilim and the cult of Yor, they will rise again, create the Nephilim, and then start the whole process over and over and over again. When I was trying to think of ways to actually destroy the Nephilim, there was a few ideas that I had floating around. One of them is that the party somehow reinstill the belief in gods, and in that way the Nephilim are destroyed by their parts being sort of taken back by these old gods. These are the gods that they're made up of. That was possibly a little bit too complicated to make real. The other way was that if they find these staffs of welling, or repair one of the staffs of welling from like the shattered pieces they'd find from the summoning sites, those could be used to summon an eidolon at a particular ley line. As well as the Nephilim, there are these, in the early Ravnica sets, there are these creatures called the eidolons. Now, I'm not entirely sure what their purpose is, and there's another thing that haven't really appeared in any Ravnica sets since then. The term eidolon is mostly associated with the Theros plane these days, as it's kind of a name for these enchantment creatures. But the eidolons in the Ravnica block, they had a sort of affinity for multicoloured spells that would allow you to replay these eidolons. I thought they're obviously some sort of creature that's got an affinity for their particular colour of magic, but they're also associated with multicoloured magic as well. I made it so that if you can summon one of these eidolons at a ley line and send it at the right Nephilim, so the particular eidolon you'd need for the Doombrood would be the blue one, the Enigma eidolon, because it's sort of lacking in blue mana, so it sort of completes the 5-colour cycle. So Inktread would be the black one, the Yordsid would be the green one, and so on. This would sort of neutralise the Nephilim for good, and it would cease to return, thus finishing off that Nephilim. This made for interesting fights where they would be sort of trying to protect the spellcaster while they messed around with the summoning spell, and they had to protect the eidolon on it as it made its way on the way to the Nephilim. And by this point, the Nephilim would probably be quite a huge threat, possibly requiring sort of an entire army to fend it off. That was how they would defeat them in the end. But if you've got a rule for defeating a monster, you've also got room to subvert that. They ended up defeating 3 of the Nephilim with the Staff of Welling they repaired. They summoned 3 eidolons one by one and defeated these Nephilim as they reappeared each fortnight. After the 3rd one, the staff shattered, leaving them with no Staff of Welling. So then they find out that the Staff of Welling came from a temple in a different district, so they had to go to that temple and solve the puzzles there and get another staff so they could defeat the last 2 Nephilim. And they defeat the 4th Nephilim with it, same as the other ones. But when they were fighting the 5th one ends up destroying the staff during the fight, so they have to come up with another way to defeat the last one. So the Glintai ended up being the final boss, and was a bit more clever and canny than the first 4. There's a lot of scenarios that you can enact with the Nephilim. The main structure of how this campaign is running out is that the Nephilims get summoned. They try and stop them. It creates a sort of cycle of like the first of the first 5 appearances of Nephilims, and then some other stuff, and then the reappearance of the first one, and defeating it again, and then realizing that they will keep on reappearing, so they have to get to the places that they expect them to be. And so this goes on, and so you're having like a fortnightly cycle, and you'll be doing stuff in between and sort of solving mysteries and whatnot. There's a lot of information they need to learn about the Nephilim, and about acquiring the Staff of Welling, or reacquiring the Staff of Welling once it's destroyed. The different Nephilim have their own groups of monsters to fight with them as well. It won't just be fighting the Nephilim. The early fights would be against cultists, such as these guys down here. There's stat lines for basic cultists and acolytes in the monster manual that work quite well for your cultists. These would be quite low-powered people to begin with. A lot of them are guildless and not very wealthy, and not necessarily very intelligent. It might be the odd one or two that's got an agenda, but they won't necessarily be doing the summoning of Nephilim for the sake of like evil. They might see the Nephilim as sort of a leveling factor in society. Some of them could have some negative animus towards the guild and want to bring things back to how things were before the guilds ever existed, things being a bit more egalitarian. So you could have early fights where you weren't necessarily fighting the Nephilim themselves. You might just be fighting parts of the Nephilim's horde. So like the very first fight that I arranged in this campaign was the Junebrood Nephilim appeared, but obviously the party at level 1 wouldn't be able to fight something of that size. So they were fighting all these sand mites that were roaming around the city plaza, and then eventually an Orzhov angel comes along and blasts the Nephilim to pieces. Then you have some early fights against more acolytes. But as time goes on, the cult of Yor gets more complicated and more structured, and they start building sort of sub-cults that have got different names like Dustmark and Blind Eye, with some sort of affinity to a particular Nephilim. They have their own agendas, and created sort of little mini-boss characters that were like cult leaders for each of the Nephilim. So these 5 characters down here, these are Mr. Sand, Mr. Ink, Mr. Teeth, Mr. Mouth, and Mr. Eye. So these work as boss characters. So they're not super powerful, but they're sort of decent low-power threats, and you could have fights against those. So a lot of these cultists are sort of attacking city infrastructure and causing a bit of havoc. Mr. Sand they fought him in a mall after he'd taken it over, and Mr. Ink had taken over a waterworks with a bunch of merfolk, and Mr. Mouth had kidnapped a judge and filled his house full of illusions. As the Nephilim each represent 4 colours of magic, it gives great scope for the powers of their followers. They're not necessarily all going to be of the same ilk. A lot of the Junebrood cultists had powers based around sand. Mr. Teeth was part of the Smelting Quarter group. They sort of annexed the Smelting Quarter and took that over, and it was sort of led by a lot of smiths and workers. So it was a lot of fire mages and fire elementals, such as these characters here, were working for them. A lot of these cultists don't necessarily know exactly the full nature of the Nephilim, and as the Nephilim are sort of just forces of nature, there's not a great deal of intelligence as to what they're doing. Some of them are more intelligent than others. The Glint Eye was a lot more sort of intelligent and villainous than the others, and the Witchmore was quite chatty and had its own agenda, but the Junebrood, the Ink Treader, and the Yortiller were mainly just big kaiju monsters that were causing havoc and not necessarily caring about what was happening. But their followers sort of like that they're destroying the guilds and causing havoc, because it furthers their egalitarian ends. So that is the basis of the campaign. I could go into a lot more detail about individual scenarios involving the Nephilim that I did. There's a lot of different monsters I created for these broods of Nephilim that have got some interesting gimmicks. And if that is anything you'd like me to go into further detail on, I'm sure I could create another video. But for now, if you'd like and subscribe, that would be great. And goodbye.